I thought we might start by just telling people why there's a need for an artificial heart, if there is, if you think there is.
Let's see if I can talk again. Well, there are about 5,000 young adults die for sure every year from total heart failure under the age of 20. So, and one of the myths, of course, is a heart transplant. I've done more heart transplants than anybody in the world. Why? Because nobody else would do them over at St. Luke's. They were all guys in private practice, and they didn't want to fool with it. But we started in '82, and heart failure, I guess, I don't know for this, it's still the leading cause of premature death in America. And the transplants have, this is about all the donors we're ever going to get. And the problem with heart transplants is they don't last. If you transplant a 20-year-old, you pretty much condemn them to a premature death. When we started doing children at Texas Children's, and I did, I think, 48 under the age of 14 in between 82 and 92, and there's only one alive. And in fact, it got so depressing for the pediatric cardiologists, they quit doing it for about 5 years. Nonetheless, for certain individual patients, it can be very meaningful and life-saving. So I don't want to denigrate it, but it's just we have to do better. This is, of course, my experience at St. Luke's, and I actually started in 1982. Nobody wanted to start because Dr. Cooley had done more heart transplants than anybody in the world in the late 60s, early 70s. Chris Bernard did the first one in South Africa. And but Dr. Cooley did 21, I think, or 22. He didn't want to fool with them. The cardiologist didn't want to fool with them. It was serendipity, which is all medicine is based on, that since I trained with Dr. DeBakey and I went over with Dr. Cooley, he wouldn't speak to me for 10 years. So I couldn't go back to Baylor, so I had an appointment at UT, and there was a guy here named Barry Cahan who was very important in getting cyclosporin introduced, because that was what made the whole field grow. It's a much better drug than the drugs we had before, and it also allowed us to transplant contaminated patients, like patients with total artificial hearts. But actually, we started in '82. Dr. Cooley came in on July the 4th, 1982. He told me he'd show me how to do one, but that was it. And he, you know, he's a good Irishman. He'd been at a party. He had a little, you know, a little tipsy, but still, you know, it's the old joke. Somebody used to say, "Who's the best surgeon in Houston?" You know. Well, the best surgeon in Houston is Dr. Cooley when he's sober. And of course, so they said, "Well, we don't want to deal with anybody like that. Who's the next best surgeon in Houston?" It's Dr. Cooley when he's drunk. So, but I mean, he wasn't drunk, but he did get he came in. He didn't like to do it, and he started out sewing the heart in, and he was sewing the right atrium to the left atrium, and I said, "Dr. Cooley, that's you know, I don't think that's going to work." And he looked at it, and he cut it all out, and he said, "See how easy it is to make that mistake, bud. I just wanted to show you how easy it was to make that mistake." Anyway, so by 1987, we did more heart transplants than any place in the country, or the world, actually, at St. Luke's. And since then, of course, other people have gotten in the act. But there's it will never meet the demand. So the artificial heart has to, mechanical hearts have always been a very important pursuit. But as I said, this is in 1987. The only two people in here without heart transplants are myself and Dr. Cooley. This is the youngest heart transplant in the world, and this is the oldest in the world that I'd done prior to 87. So it can be very rewarding, of course, but none of those people are alive now. So that's briefly why we need heart transplants after. So you'll feel a little of this anyway. But we need heart transplants if we're going to be able to meaningfully impact premature death from heart failure. We need mechanical devices, something we can pull off the shelf. Anyway.
Do you want to tell the story of when you were working with DeBakey and the kid that you tried to save with your hands? Yeah. Would you say that led to thinking about the mechanical heart? No,
I didn't. I actually wasn't too interested in medicine at all, and this is something else I hate to go into. It is creativity is impossible looking backward. I had dinner with this Irish singer one time, and we spent the whole evening talking about that. And he said that he was successful. I didn't know him, my daughter did, but he explained to me who he was on the way to this dinner. And but he was very interested in heart surgery, so he pointed out that he'd never had any music lessons. And so he wrote all his own music, and he and his group did. So, and he thought that allowed him to be creative. And this is, you know, you hear a lot of this, and this is one of my pet peeves, you know, if you're doing something that hadn't been done before, there's no evidence for it. So how are you going to have evidence for something that there's no evidence? Anyway, you don't need to go through that. But I got involved. This is interesting. This is the medical center. This is where we are right now. And this is 1949. Dr. Bakey came here in 49. Here Baylor was built, and Herman, and that was it. And he heard gunshots, and they were hunting out here in all this woods, you know. So it's really changed a bit. And here's Dr. DeBakey, who is a very moving force in this field. And he looks a little like Groucho Marx, but believe me, he was not funny. And this is the Baylor that I went to, the Texas Medical Center. The medical students parked right here, and we just walked over here to Baylor. And of course, this is where we are now in this whole. All I did was play football growing up in Texas, you know, and I was interested in girls and football. And I got hurt when I was in my spring training of '60, playing for Darrell Royal, and that ended my football career. So I decided to go to medical school, really on a whim, because I'd never taken a pre-med course. And I was graduating. I had to do something. My mother told me she could do anything I wanted as long as I didn't have to cheat, lie, or steal. Well, that sort of limits it, it turns out. As a 21-year-old, I couldn't think of anything. I thought of being a history teacher. Well, that's, you know, I didn't want to be a teacher. That's what my parents were, and they were always grading papers. I didn't want to be a dentist. I thought about being a dentist. Be in someone's mouth all my life, and a Methodist minister. My uncle was a Methodist minister, but he was mean as a snake, and I didn't want to deal with him. So, and then I thought about physician. Well, I'd read a lot of Chekhov because I was a history major, English major, and the doctor's stories. You should always. There's wonderful stories that Chekhov, who was a doctor, wrote, and that's what convinced me to go into medicine. I'd never taken a pre-med course. At UT, you could take them all in 1 year, and I took them all in 1 year and interviewed for medical school. I had a girlfriend in Houston, so I wanted to go to Baylor. It had nothing to do with anything else. And in those days, there was no computer, so they ask you, you come to the interview, and they'd tell you in a couple of 3 days whether you were going to be accepted or not. At that time, Baylor was, one of the best medical schools in the South. There were more students from, there were only 19 in my class that were from the state of Texas. The rest were from all over the country, and they took 75. But I was interviewed on the weekend of July the 4th, and Hebel Hoff, it turned out, was the chief of the admissions committee and the very prominent physiologist. I didn't know who the hell he was. And he asked me, since you're a history major, what other event happened on July the 4th other than signing the Declaration? So we're celebrating the 4th. I said, well, Adams and Jefferson both died on July the 4th, 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration. I think that's what he wanted. But I also point out that the Battle of Gettysburg really was the last, which would really spelt the end for the Confederacy, was on July the 4th of 1863. Pickett's charge was July 3rd. Lee didn't start retreating until July the 4th. And Vicksburg was surrendered by Pemberton on July the 4th, 1863, for the same reason, so he could get better conditions from Grant. And that's what really ended the Civil War. I always remember, then they were grueling interviews. They usually ask you a lot of questions. He looked at my application for a while, and then he slammed it to, and he said, if you want to come here, you can. Let's go out and enjoy the 4th. So that's something a history major may help you with. I don't think he knew about Pemberton or the Gettysburg. So at that time, DeBakey was everywhere, and he had his own press agents, his sisters. He got in all the media, and he really was never a very good heart surgeon. I hate to say this. If you were over at Methodist, I mean, he was better certainly than 90% of the people in the country. But the people at Methodist, and Cooley was the best one that'll ever live. He was like Lindbergh. He did things nobody could do. But Dr. DeBakey got in with the media. He was very well known all over the world. Here he is. This is in Life magazine. These are the first artificial hearts that they were working on. They were handmade over at Baylor in the old lab. And you can imagine trying to get this today, this poor calf all wired up. But this is, the one thing Dr. DeBakey really did do is he got money for it. And that's what really started the field. Because the NIH had never funded a clinical program prior to the artificial heart program that Dr. DeBakey got. They studied the motion of mast cells and things like that, but they didn't fund. They didn't study. They didn't fund anything but sort of basic science. But this was the first clinical effort that they made, and this just, oh no.
My major goal now, as far as my research work is concerned, is to perfect the artificial heart.
So this was a real stimulus, and today we have this anger management. I know somebody got fired over it in our lab because he didn't really hit anybody. He just put his hands on one of the technicians that were supposed to have been watching an animal, and they got fired. But
Back in the 1960s, Michael DeBakey was one of a handful of leading heart surgeons. He was known as the Texas Tornado.
What do you mean it's not flushing? Yeah, he cut it off. God damn it. I know, but you don't know what I want to do, you see.
Well, Dr. Baker was quite a taskmaster. He was, it was like working under a Marine drill sergeant. It's the patient's life that you're concerned about. And I think Dr. Baker always emphasized that in a manner that was very forceful.
Ever put your hand in front of my line of vision? No. Put your finger over that. Then you're not concentrating. You're watching me.
Never stopped. Never stopped.
Brought to Texas a host of luminaries.
Beat you up the whole operation.
The Shah of Iran and the Duke of Windsor.
Yes. All righty. So with all the medical skill of Europe available, why did you come to Houston?
Houston.
To debate?
That's the Duke of Windsor.
Most people are dreaming of
There was an order you had to walk in this line here, you know, depending where you were in the system. Now this is you heard the whole time. These are things, just a few things you heard during the operation, you know. See if there's any sign of brain activity, you know, with the resident. You heard this all the time, you know, 3 hands, I wouldn't even need you at all. I went in to see one of the junior faculty, I mean, one time, and they were all standing in the corner, and Dr. DeBakey was doing the case with just a nurse and yelling at them, you know, with this constant, and he took all these men in their 30s, late 30s, and told them to stand in the corner just like he would a first grader, and they had to stand in the corner until the case was over, you know, and he did it by himself. So this is probably something that wouldn't exist today, you know, but he did teach you a lot. Nobody learned more. This is one of his favorite mantras, and of course he's certainly right about that. This is the meanest thing I ever heard him say to somebody, and I don't know how that would go over in anger management class today, you know. But we heard that every now and then too. And we always call George Noon God damn it, because he never even used his name without saying God damn it, George. And of course it was George Noon that later saved his life. But we had to write a research paper, and just by serendipity I got involved with it. A friend of mine, this guy named Frank Polk, who was a fraternity brother of mine at Texas, who was one of these guys that was always ahead of the game. You know, he always did things. And he actually, we had to write a research paper every year. And it was October, but as freshmen, we had to have our title by November the 1st. It was October the 30th. And Frank came up to me. I was standing in front of the elevator. And he said, "Bud, what are you going to do for your research paper?" And I said, "I got another day." I hadn't thought about it, you know. I never did anything. And he said, "I knew you wouldn't have done anything. I've already written a research paper. And we're going to do heart transplants and try to induce tolerance in heart transplants." And that's how I got into surgery. And the next year, we did this artificial heart work with Domingo Leota. And this was the guy that made the first heart. And he did it over in the Baylor labs. And it was a fascinating pump. I started working on this in 1965, of course. And I always remember Dr. Bakey telling me this. He thought it would be pretty easy, you know. We're going to the moon, we're going to do all this stuff, cure world hunger, et cetera, et cetera. And we did go to the moon, but we didn't have 100,000 patients with an artificial heart. And this was an NIH thing just to show you how goofy it is. They thought by the early 80s we would be in patients with an artificial heart. And they had the funding of it, you know. But, of course, that wasn't the case. Anyway, what was the question? I've forgotten now. Well, how I got started?
You think of the heart as just a pump.
This is a good line.
And it seemed logical that if that's the main function, you ought to be able to duplicate that mechanically.
Well, it did seem logical, but it was a lot harder. Remember, your heart beats 100,000 times every 24 hours. So that meant if you were going to have a pump that would last 10 years, 15 years, beating 100,000 times every 24 hours, it was quite a mechanical challenge. What else was it? I don't want to go over.
Bud, wasn't there a story where you had a patient that was dying in the operating room, and Dr. DeBakey, you were trying to keep him alive?
Well, we had to, as medical students, we'd work up the patients, and it was, I was on Dr. DeBakey's service, and I worked with this young Italian boy, 18 years old. He spoke English, his mother did, and he had severe rheumatic heart disease, and charming kid. He was looking forward to, getting his heart fixed, and so he could go back to a normal life. They had a heart valve that worked reasonably well, and Dr. DeBakey was going to replace it. And his mother was with him. She couldn't speak English, but other than his mother, he was by himself. And anyway, we operated on him. He did well. And that night, he arrested. He had a cardiac arrest. And so I was the youngest and the strongest. In those days, you just opened the chest and you started massaging the heart by hand. And I was massaging the heart by hand. And I always remember he looked up at me and he reached up to try to grab me. And and the nurse finally came and, gave him some morphine. Dr. Bakey came in, and we couldn't get the heart started again. It was just a bad heart, and so Dr. Bakey told us to quit. But of course, I wasn't going to quit. I was 25, and the kid was looking up at me, and they finally, the resident, who was a crazy guy we call Mad Dog Hoffman, actually hit me and knocked me off of him too. But I thought, if my hand could keep this kid alive, why couldn't we develop a pump of some sort to keep him alive, keep patients like this alive? And I think that's one of the things that really stimulated me further to try to work on this technology. And it is interesting that 50 years later, I guess, this girl that appeared on the People magazine recently, sometime in the last 10 years, with the pump that we developed. We were taking her to surgery, and she had a cardiac arrest, and we opened her chest, and I was massaging her heart, just like I was doing this boy nearly 50 years earlier, and we just took a pump off the shelf, and she's alive and well today, 5 years later. So we did. I was fortunate enough to see that in my lifetime.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of pump she has? When I started my research, Frank Michel said, well, you need to know about LVADs, and I immediately thought, why do I need to know about LVADs? And talk about the development of that in terms of the artificial heart.
Well, first of all, that heart that we showed you, I mean, this is really had a lot of impact on the development of this medical center. Is Domingo Leota figured out at some point that Dr. Bakey was never going to put the heart in, because Dr. Bakey was 52 years old when he started doing heart surgery, and he never really got, as I said, as slick at it. And Cooley was the slickest in the world, and he could do things that nobody could do. And he knew if anybody was going to put it in, it would be Cooley. So one time, when Dr. DeBakey was out of town, Domingo Leota took the heart over, and they put it in at St. Luke's. And that, of course, Dr. DeBakey was very predictable. Dr. Cooley knew he'd get fired, but I think that's what he wanted. So he. But anyway, so this is the first total artificial heart in a human to go in. This was April of 1969. This is the first in the world. Dr. Cooley did it. He sewed it in 45 minutes. The patient actually did pretty well, but they way over immune suppressed him and he died of an infection. But the pump worked beautifully. And of course, Dr. Bakey didn't take it very well. And he fired everybody in the lab.
Now, Dr. Cooley had no experience with the artificial heart program at all. Didn't do any laboratory work. He was a good surgeon, but that's all.
But that's all. I always loved that. And there was some truth to that. He didn't do any lab work, and they didn't do, it was a real limitation. And I was in Vietnam at this time. I was in a assault helicopter company. I got shot down twice, and but I said it was probably a safer place than being in Houston. So, but I came back and we started working. I finished at Baylor, and then I came over with Dr. Cooley because by then the lab at Baylor was dissolved, so the only lab was at St. Luke's. So I basically stayed there, and we were working by then on the LVAD, the left heart replacement, not the total heart, because the total heart by the early 70s seemed too complicated and didn't seem we could do it. We had a project of the total heart, but we didn't think we could do it, so this was a partial heart replacement. We put it underneath the diaphragm here, and to take over the failing heart. And this was actually a very successful, and it was, I'm trying to limit. I came over to Baylor because I thought I'd come back to Baylor, and Dr. Crawford, who was the guy I worked with the most at Baylor, told me to not even come over there unless I wore a fake beard or something, because he didn't want Dr. DeBakey to see him talking to me, and it wasn't quite that bad, but I certainly wasn't going to go back to Baylor. So that's how I was the first chief of cardiac surgery here at UT. This is just something nobody believes any other place, but this is one day at St. Luke's. We did more heart surgery there than any place in the world. And this is just one day, and this is one day of Dr. Cooley's schedule. But the LVADs were funded by NIH. They did what they call an RFP. That's where they do everything. You want to make a plane, you want to do anything. The government doesn't make anything. And that's one good thing about our system. They give the RFP, request for proposals, and they decide from the experts what they want their proposals to be. They want a plane that'll fly, around the world and, in 2 hours, whatever. And companies propose what they're going to do, and they have to put a huge outlay for whatever it is, and they may or may not get it. And this is the way this field started. It really couldn't have started anywhere else but the U.S., and it couldn't have started if Dr. DeBakey hadn't gotten the money in '64, because once the government starts something, it can't stop it. So they developed a device and technology division of the NIH, and they always had to have a project. And so that's how this sort of propagated itself. And one of the parts of the RFP was it was supposed to last 2 years. And this was a limitation. This was the first pump we did. And this is the first Elva, and we put it on calves. The calves are the best animal for this. And this inlet cannula was the problem, because if blood never stops moving in your heart. It's always moving. But in this pump, it would stop in this inlet cannula. While the pump was pumping, it would stop briefly, but it would stop. The blood doesn't stop moving. And this is an example of our early pump, and this is what would happen to it in the calf. We could never overcome this. And it was a real barrier to the whole development of the pump. And I was working with the chief of the lab then, was a wonderful man who was a AOA. He was at the summa cum laude at Harvard. He was the AOA at Harvard Medical School, smartest guy I've ever known, and a very sweet, nice guy. And he had, brilliant, and he was stumped by this, and he was going to give up. We were actually going to quit the pump, and we stopped it. And any of the people, there were still a few people around that remember that it was this inlet obstruction was going to cause us to quit. Now, how did I happen to know that that was a problem? Well, I happen to know, and I often think about this. As I said, we didn't have attention deficit syndrome when I was growing up because we had mean people teaching us, like Miss Murray. If you even, I get nervous. I don't even like to look at that picture. And she's been dead forever. But if you even moved in her class, and if you even spoke out, your hands went and that ruler came down on them. So, nobody spoke, and you memorized the whole Lang's book of English grammar. Everybody did it, and there was no out. And of course, Dr. Baker was the same way. We had a patient named Kaplan that kept occluding his film pop. 5 times in a row he occluded, but he finally got up on the floor. The nurse calls me in the middle of the night, tells me it's occluded. So I go back down. I go up to see him, and it is occluded. His leg is cold. Now, Dr. Baker never carried a beeper, so you had to know where he was. But you pretty well knew where he was at any given time. So I knew he was in his office after midnight. He never slept, but that was the other. He was a mutant of some sort. He never slept. And I went down there, and I knew if I hadn't been at Baylor and I hadn't known him, I was a DeBakey scholar in my class, which was bad because it meant he remembered you more. And I said, Dr. DeBakey, I wish you would look at Mr. Kaplan. I'm worried about his leg. Now, if I'd gone in and said, Dr. DeBakey, Mr. Kaplan's graft has clotted off again, he would have fired me. See, you didn't say things like that to him. But he was grumbled, and he went up and to see him. And you never ask him a question. That was the other thing. You knew, never ask him a question because he didn't want to hear your questions. You just learned on your own. So, but I was so sleepy, and I'd been up all night, and I just said under my breath, I said, I wonder why the graft keeps clotting. And he immediately took me outside, and he said, I remember him just so clearly, he said, when blood stops moving, it clots. Is that too hard for your pea-sized brain? And then he hit me right in the chest. And I said, no, sir, I understand. And then he went through Virchow's triad. And then he said, repeat after me. When blood starts moving, it clots, right? So I said, well, when blood starts moving, it clots. He hit me again. That's right. Never forget it. Well, I never forgot it because that was what was wrong with this pump, because the blood stopped moving throughout the duration of systole while the pump was pumping. The blood was stopped in there, and that's what stopped it. And that's why it was building up this obstruction. And all we did was remove the inlet cannula. It worked beautifully. And this was the first pump to be approved by the FDA as a left ventricular assist device. And I always, reflect it. I don't know if I would have remembered it quite as well if it hadn't had that poke in my chest at the same time, But his teaching method stuck with you. Anyway, this was the first pump that patients left the hospital with. They could go back to work, but it was a problem in its durability. It didn't last. It only lasted about 2 years. The membrane, fatigue. So that's the first LVAD that we used. And we started working on, and this is one of the things I think is also important. I knew Norman Shumway very well because Shumway started his medical training in my hometown in West Texas, and he I always sort of had a good relationship with him. But he had a debate with Jarvik in the early 80s on national television on artificial heart or heart transplant. This was very, hot on the news all the time. Jarvik was on the news all the time. And I remember Shumway saying, well, the problem with, and Jarvik was a very slick, good-looking guy, and Shumway was just staid, sort of middle-aged, Midwestern guy. He wasn't very lively. And Jarvik, of course, obviously won the debate. Here he was about that time. He was sort of crazy. This is when he was in Playboy. So here's Jarvik, and he was debating against Shumway, for standard physician. And but Shumway made a very good point. He said, look, this pump's a nightmare. It's not good for the field because if they can only live 2 years, you can't change it out every 2 years. All it will do is prolong the transplant list. And he was right. I mean, if you're not going to be able to, you save individual lives, but you're not going to address the problem. So that's when I started working on the, and this is the pump. The main problem with them not only was durability, but the size of them. These were big pumps. They were life-saving, and they let people go back to work. But you can't expect these things to last forever. Not forever, but somebody told me, he said, you need one at least 10 years. You got to have another approach to it. And the only other approach I could think of was a non-pulsatile pump. At the capillary level, there's no pulse. The only organ that actually needs a pulse is the heart itself. So I started working on continuous flow pumps. Now, success has many fathers. Failure is always a bastard. We always know that. But nobody's ever challenged me on this because nobody was interested in continuous flow pump. All I could hear was all the negativity. You had to have a pulse, la-di-da-di-da. And but I couldn't see any way we could have a long-term pump if we didn't have a non-pulsatile pump. And these two guys, this guy showed me the first one to work. And it's interesting, Wampler made this first continuous flow pump. And he showed it to me at a meeting in Louisville. It's an Archimedes screw pump, 2,000 years ago. It's Archimedes screw. And they still use it. He was on a missionary travels. He still goes on the missionary travel. And he made this little pump the size of an eraser on a number 2 lead pencil. And he showed it to me, and he said, we could put this in the heart, and it'll take over for the heart. And I said, it's going to hemolyze, be like a wearing blender. But again, that's why we did the animal experiment. It didn't hemolyze. And I asked him, I said, well, how did you know it wouldn't hemolyze? And he said, I didn't. So that's, again, you have to do the experiment, let nature give you the answer. And we began putting these in the 1988, and this is the first patient to have a continuous flow pump. Now, as I said, none of this was funded. We had no NIH funding at all. And I had some internal funding, Dunn Foundation. Houston's always had these wonderful foundations that we could get money from, and I could squeeze some money out of them. Jarvik didn't have any money, and Wampler had some from his company. Here's a young boy that had nothing. He had no heart function at all. All he had was that little pump. And here he is awake and eating a popsicle. So I knew you didn't have to have a pump. You didn't have to have a pulse. Nobody else did, but I did that. I guess Wampler and I did. And Jarvik and I started working on a long-term pump at the same time as I started working on this. This was everywhere, everywhere. It was very excited about this, Wall Street Journal and the London Times, everything, because nobody believed this. And again, just shows you have to do the experiment and let the experiment show you which way to go. And that certainly was the Kitty Hawk of the field. Now, with Jarvik, we also developed the blood wash bearings. Nobody else believed those were possible. And we developed those by, Jarvik would make these pumps in New York. He lived in Lincoln Center. He was married to Ash Marilyn, the world's most intelligent woman. She does have the highest IQ in the world. I tested her 3 times. She's never gone to college. She knows that George Washington was the first president, but she won't know who the second president was. But she's a lot of fun, and she can beat you on a Rubik's Cube, I guarantee you. There's something about her brain. But we did all these experiments, and then we also showed after 5 years, that you could have a blood wash bearing, because you had to have bearings in this pump. And that would open up the field further to an implantable continuous flow pump. But our poor calves, the national or the animal of Texas. I mean, it's poor things, but we do have to have them in order to do this experiment. So this is how the continuous flow LVADs were developed. Again, nobody thought that it was absolutely impossible to have something that would spin at 25,000 RPM and something that a bearing that wasn't lubricated. You have oil in your car for your bearings, You can't have a non-lubricated bearing. It's impossible. That's what everybody said. And, of course, it wasn't. And so we started using these pumps. I put the first long-term one. We put the first bridge to transplant in at St. Luke's. But the first long-term pump, we put in this man who was a hospice counselor in England, and he was dying of heart failure. And he decided he didn't want to die of heart failure. So he called me and asked me if he could put one of these pumps in. And I went to Oxford. I put this in at Oxford. And he wrote 2 books after he had the pump implanted. Wonderful guy, went everywhere, did everything. And but he was over anticoagulated. He was in the British health system, which you can think of on paper as a good idea, but it isn't in reality. It's good if you don't get sick. If you get sick, that's the last place you want to be. But he was over anticoagulated, and he died of nosebleeds. He went into the hospital in Manchester. He died of nosebleeds and a poor judgment of women because for some reason he got involved with 2 different women, and they both came, and one of them was his wife. Of course, he was just sort of involved with her automatically. But there was another woman involved. They come to the hospital. He's passed out. He's bleeding. He needs a blood transfusion. The British don't like to do anything. They won't give him permission to transfuse him. Neither of the women. They fought with each other. So there's a lesson in that, too. But I think if they were to transfuse him, he'd still be alive, because these bearings showed no wear at all. There were no wear. So that was the start of the field of continuous flow LVADs. All right, what's your next question?
Do you want to talk about the guy that you implanted in March 2012 and what happened, or 2011, Mr. Lewis?
Well, that's a big jump. All right, as we implanted more and more of these, of course, we need a total artificial heart. There are a number of patients. I've had 2 die this last month over at St. Luke's. That we need a total heart replacement, and we can't just do transplants. They don't come out of the air. So we still really need a total heart. And I began working in 2005 to I'm going to skip through all this. To make a total artificial, completely implantable heart without a pulse. I will say, here's a 25-year-old boy with the LVAD that's what we call the HeartMate 2, which is identical to the Jarvik. It's just put in a little differently. And he was 25 years old. He came in dying of heart failure. And here he's about 28. And his heart finally recovered enough that we could take the pump out. So if I'd transplanted him, and he's a smart kid, he was an engineer, and he knew that he wouldn't live to be 50 if he was going to have a heart transplant, and he just had a kid, and so he didn't want a heart transplant. And I don't like to transplant young patients, as I told you. And but you see, his heart is that little pump, and that's what's doing all the work. And I took it out, but I told him he could play 6 sets of tennis without any trouble with this thing, but he can't do it anymore.
6,000.
Yeah. Anyway, and I recently went to Kazakhstan. They put in over 300. They put in over 450 pumps now in Kazakhstan. These small continuous flow pumps, and more than 35,000 have been implanted worldwide. So we got around, I think, the nightmare, because now these pumps, we've had over 100 patients that have had pumps in, single pumps, for over 10 years. So we've solved the durability problem. So we then began working on a total heart replacement, because, as I said, sometimes you need the total heart and replaced. And one of the ways this is another whole subject. Here, my daughter doesn't believe that's me. She says, "Who is that guy? That's not you. You were never that thin." Anyway, I'm sorry, I wasn't actually planning on using this. So, and a number of these patients, like that boy I showed you, we've removed the pump from, because I think a lot of the hearts will recover if you rest them properly. But the total heart replacement, this is what the last thing we'll touch on. Again, we go back to man's best friend and the calf. And this animal, we removed the total heart. This was 2005, and replaced it with 2 continuous flow pumps, 2 small pumps. So there was no pulse at all, and yet the animal was awake and eating, and we put him on a treadmill. We had the treadmill, they can walk, they can exercise, and this was the first demonstration that you could do this in a patient, and we did in an animal, and then we did it in a patient in 2011. This patient was dying of heart failure. We took him to the OR. He had a small heart. An LVAD wouldn't work in him, because the LVAD, as I said, doesn't work in a lot of these patients. We totally replaced the pump. He'd been in the ICU for 2 weeks, intubated and dying. And here he is, just 2 continuous flow pumps, and his heart gone. And he woke up, worked on his computer. Sadly, he had a disease called amyloidosis that we found out later was involving the liver and the kidney. So he and his family decided to cut the pumps off. But it worked. It works beautifully in the patient. And because of this, I guess this is the last thing I want to touch on. We're now going from the pump that didn't work in the 60s. We now have a pump. This young engineer who came to me a few years ago, and his father had died of heart failure. Serendipity, again, not evidence-based medicine. He's a brilliant engineer, And he began working on a total artificial heart that's powered with a continuous flow. And that's this pump. This is another earlier total artificial heart. You can see the difference in size. And this works, it has only one moving part. And the moving part is pumping to both the lungs and the body. And incredibly, it has a Starling's response. That means as you need more blood, you walk up a flight of stairs, it will pump more, just like the natural heart does. And that has to do with the position of this pump, of the spinning part, the one moving part. And this, of course, is the last thing I would like to see while I'm still vertical, since I started working on it so long ago. And I will say in 2005, I went over to see Dr. DeBakey, who was, I guess, 96 at that time. And he and showed him that we could totally replace the heart with these continuous flow pumps. And he said, you know, Bud, it's a wonderful idea. It's a wonderful idea. I think I did some research on this in the 60s. He didn't, but he'd been in academics enough. He was always going to hedge his bets. You know, it's just a reflex in academia. You always, if you can't do anything else, lie. And but he said, you know, work on this, Bud. In 5 years, we'll have it in patients. Well, you know, in 5 years, he would have been 101. And I didn't say anything. And I knew what he was thinking, or he knew what I was thinking. And he said, of course, Bud, we all hope you'll still be around by then. And sadly, he's didn't make it, but I think we will see it. You see, it's just this one moving part, one moving part. It's suspended by magnets, and the magnets tell it where to be according to the inflow. So if it moves just a little bit one way or the other, it flows more. And that's an incredible technology. And it works. We've already had it in animals. We have an animal over there now. We've got on the treadmill. We've had it on twice. So we'll have this in patients within 2 years. And it will be a long-term pump that'll work. Pulsal pumps will never work. Will never. You never say never in anything, but right now it's just 100,000 motions every 24 hours is a bit a little much. Plus, you don't need a pulse, of course. I will say also, this pump, this engineer, by changing the speed of the pump, he can create a blood pressure curve just like a normal 120/80. He can put it anywhere you want. And I guess the last story, I always remember the Fraziers are redneck Scotch-Irish mean people. And I was named after a gunfighter who was killed in a gunfight in 1896 in Fort Stockton. You can look it up in the Texas history if you have any interest in it at all. But my mother's family was a little better, and my grandfather, my mother's father, was the first organic chemistry teacher at A&M in 1900. He started teaching. He taught there for 40 years. Brilliant guy, lived forever. And I came back from Vietnam. I went to see him in 1970. And I said, Granddaddy, what do you think about him landing on the moon? And he said, he's a wonderful guy. I just told him he knew everything. And he said, oh, they didn't land on the moon. I said, come on, Granddaddy. Of course they landed on the moon. He said, no, they faked it somehow. I don't know how they did it, but they faked it. I said, I don't want to even hear you say that, you know. It's just an embarrassment. You're an intelligent man. And he said, okay, maybe they did land on the moon. But remember, I drove mules to Oklahoma in the land rush, which was 1889. I was volunteered for World War I, but I was too old for World War I. And I can't describe to you my astonishment when I saw the first plane fly over. So coming from that to going to the moon was just too much. He said, maybe they did go to the moon, but I just don't want to think about it. And I asked this young engineer, how do you know? How do you do that and position that? And he said, well, we have these data points that tells it exactly where it needs to be according to the pressure on the inflow side. And it's going, we have 20,000 data points a second, and that tells it where to be. I said, wait a minute, 20,000 data points a second? I mean, you mean 20,000 data points a day or an hour? He said, no, Dr. Frazier, it's 20,000 data points a second. And I immediately thought of my grandfather, whose line was, you know, maybe they did go to the moon, but I just don't want to think about it. Said maybe it is 20,000 data points a second, but I just don't want to think about it. So I think that's what you will all see in your lifetimes, this technology. If we don't blow ourselves up somehow, we'll finally solve it. And it's all done in this medical center. I think that's one of the things. You should know something about the history of our medical center is very unique, and it depended on very few people. And as I said, to come from a forest 60 years ago to what it is today, I think is remarkable. And I think we've all been beneficiaries of it. Okay, you got any other questions to hit? I think these people
questions for Dr. Frazier?
ready to get out of here.
Is your funding being researched? I mean, is your research being funded now?
Pardon me?
Is your research being funded?
Well, it is now. I mean, but that's one of the big problems with the LVADs. I mean, the first pulsed pump, we had a lot of NIH funding, again, for Dr. DeBakey. But when I started this continuous flow pumps, I did it just with local money that I could scrounge up, and it was all internal. And we didn't have the funding to develop it properly. So there are a lot of complications, not a lot, but there are complications with that implantable LVAD that are soluble. You know, the Catholics, I always love the Catholics deals for a lot of things. I'm not a Catholic, but they have these mortal sins and venal sins. As I said, the problem with the postal pump to me was mortal, 20,000, 100,000 beats every 24 hours was too much. But all the problems with the implantable continuous flow LVADs that are being used here in Methodist and in St. Luke's, everywhere, and all of them are soluble, but the companies won't solve them. It's the other thing I've learned. It doesn't matter how easy it is to solve them, because we can power these through the skin, for example. We could do that in the 70s. Because we didn't have any funding, it was cheaper to do the first work going what we call percutaneously through the skin. And about over 20% of those get infected. Well, there's no reason to even have one. But you tell the companies that, they're not going to change it because they don't have to. They're still making a lot of money. And there's about 3 things that they need to do that if we'd had government funding, we would have solved it before it went into the patients. But we didn't. All this was developed without any government funding. And that's because, as I said, when we started, nobody believed in it.
You want to talk about who some of your funders are now, or is that a secret?
What?
You want to talk about one of your major local funders on the Bible Corps, or is that a secret?
Well, it's not a secret. It's the mattress guy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does he need a new heart?
Well, I don't know. He coughed up the money for some reason. There's a lot of money in mattresses, I guess. So, but he gave us $5 million. So, but it's much better. I mean, the NIH funding is a pain. The system is a pain. I've been on the NIH Advisory Council. You know, spent a lot of time in Washington over the years, and the system is a little flawed. But once you get it, it's wonderful because you can do the work. And if you can do the work, that see, the problem with private funding are investors, they want to make money, you know. And if they're not making money in 2 or 3 years, they'll back out on it. That's what happened to that hemopump, that little pump the size of an eraser. That was a wonderful idea, but it was all funded by venture capitalists in San Francisco. They didn't want to fool with the FDA, and they got involved in, you know, some land deal in Seattle. You know, they don't care. And so it is, I think, one of our big limitations. And so far, our local funding for this has been, let's say, understanding. But I keep reminding the engineers and the people involved that these people, they didn't invest the money just because they want to love mankind and they want to help everybody. They want to make money. And the beautiful thing about the NIH funding is once you get the grant, then you can do the work. The private funding, you get the money, and then you have to, unless it's a pure philanthropy, like, as I say, the Dunn Foundation, and we've been so fortunate in Houston with the Cullens and Jesse Jones and all these foundations, and that's really the best way to fund it.
Any other questions?
Anyone else?
Do you understand all of that? Just took me about 10 seconds to get it. This is my 3rd year working on the book.
It's easy. Yeah.
If you would suggest to people to live more healthy for heart health, what one suggestion would you make?
For heart health? I don't know. I always remember I was in San Diego. Mehmet Oz, who's another Frankenstein sort of thing. But I got Mehmet Oz involved in these pumps, and he's a very good surgeon, I'll tell you. He was one of the best ones at Columbia. And he did all the work up there, and that's how he got his name. And he got on a national TV on the LVADs, which I showed him how to do, and I've sort of created him. But I don't know. It's crazy. I've only seen 5 minutes of his show. I sat down and wrote him a letter and said, look, Mehmet, don't give up your day job. But somehow or another, he's still around. It was 2000. We were out in San Diego, and Dr. Bakey came out there. So 2000, he would have been 92. And he flew out by himself. He had his slides, gave a beautiful talk. And Oz was very fanatic about exercise and diet and everything. And Dr. Bakey, after he gave his talk, he went up to him and said, Dr. Bakey didn't like people asking him questions, and he really didn't like Oz. And he said, Dr. Bakey, it's just wonderful. How do you do this? So what is your exercise regimen? And Dr. Bakey said, well, I used to walk upstairs, but I don't anymore. I just take the elevator. That was it. Well, what about your diet? What about your diet? And Dr. Bakey, telling the truth, because I've seen him, he said, you know what I really like are these, I like these tamales. We have tamales down in Texas, and they're really good. And these Snickers bars. Have you ever? You know, these Snickers bars are really good, you know, and they're very nutritious, you know. And of course, Oz was, and the last thing he said, and I was standing behind him, you know, telling him, stop it, Oz, stop it. And he said, well, what about your religious, do you ever pray, do you pray before you go into surgery? He asked Dr. Bakey that. So how dark he is. Do you pray before, and then Dr. Bakey looked at him and said, no, I don't pray before I go into surgery. And I would be mistrustful of any surgeon who felt he needed divine intervention to perform the surgery, you know. And but he did say one of the few funny things I ever heard him say after he thought of me. He said, I must confess, though, sometimes I pray after the surgery. And so anybody that's been in a bad jam in surgery can understand that. But the only two things I know that are helpful, I do think are helpful, are regular exercise, if you can do it. It doesn't tear, swimming, I think, is probably the best thing you can do. I think the diet makes no sense at all. All you have to do is follow the history of diets in America. We didn't have any heart disease until the 20s and 30s, or coronary disease of any consequence. And all we ate was butter and fats and all the things that you're not supposed to eat. But I think regular exercise is good, and swimming is the best if you can do it, and aspirin. And and you should take as much aspirin as you can tolerate. I take it till my ears ring, and then I back off. And I take 6 a day, 350 milligram aspirin every day, and I do think that helps. It's a very good anti-inflammatory. It has something to do with the platelets. And this organic chemist grandfather I told you, that's what he did. He took 8 a day, and but for arthritis, he did it for arthritis because as organic chemist, he knew that salicylic acid changes the solubility coefficient of calcium. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I assume it is true. And he never had any arthritis. But I wish I could give you some magic formula, and I'm just get sick of these people that seem to continue to come up with the diets. And that's a metaphysical problem too. When I was in medical school, they absolutely knew that low cholesterol, they'd done the studies at Framingham, absolutely diet would control coronary artery disease. We have just as much as we ever had. In fact, probably more than we had in the 60s. We just can do more for it. So we've known that. We were going to cure cancer. We had 5-FU was going to cure cancer. And all infectious disease were going to be cured. This is when I was a medical student. And of course, we're still in the struggle. We've made a lot of advances. But I do think a regular exercise and sensible eating, sensible. I think all I learned, when growing up in Texas, in the 5th grade, we took health. And it told you to eat a balanced diet, pictures of different colored foods on your plate, get a good night's sleep, and to exercise. And that's about it, You don't need these diet books or anything. Take 5th grade health.
Why Kazakhstan? What's the connection?
Well, it's strange. Kazakhstan is a strange country, They're very prosperous. And they've got one guy, the best form of government is a benevolent dictator. And somehow or another they got this guy with an unpronounceable name who's in with the communists. And once they started breaking up, he got Kazakhstan, which is nearly an empty country, it's all desert. That's where a lot of the gulags were there. Stalin used to send them out there to die. And but they also have a lot of oil. And they built this beautiful city, Astana, which is absolutely the most modern city I've ever been in, I think. Everything's new there. Have a beautiful medical school. Everything's taught in English there. All the courses are in English. They speak perfect English. I was the oldest person I saw in this whole city. And they have a heart center there, and they have a very, very good technical surgeon that came over here over a decade ago or more and trained. And they can't do transplants. I mean, they don't have a system for getting donors. So they put these pumps in. And some of the longest lived patients with these pumps are in Kazakhstan. So it's just like everything else. They had the money. And this, if you know the history, you would know who the guy's name is. But I think he's still alive. But he was able to isolate Kazakhstan from Russia, and control their own. They control their own finances.
Anyone else?
Why the use of calves? Why is that the particular lab animal that was used?
What?
Why calves?
They live. They survive. We tried the sheep were very sweet too, but they don't live. They're very sheepish, of course. And the one thing about a sheep is they have to be with other sheep. You literally, if you just do one sheep, you got to put other sheep around them because they'll die if they're alone. They don't like to be alone. And but the calf is very durable. The bad thing about the calf is they outgrow the technology. They grow so rapidly. And now they're the standard animal. And pigs, of course, are pigs. That's why they call them pigs. They're awful. They'll bite you. They're mean, and they're very smart, unfortunately. But we don't use the pigs. We use them for some of our coronary artery stem cell work, and we have used the sheep occasionally for miniature pumps. And but the calf became the standard really in the 60s for doing all this work. Here, Dr. DeBakey, started using the calves, and that was, if we had a better animal, it was sad, these animals. I don't like it. I never liked to hunt. I never liked to kill things. And I'll be glad if we see the day that we don't even have to use them. But if we don't, because nearly every device that we've developed, we've found something to change in the calf. This pump, nothing about the pump, this continuous flow pump, nothing about the pump. That's an engineering marvel. But about the way we do the connectors, the interface between the blood and the pump, we've gone through several iterations of that, and we learned that from our calf experiments.
Well, you all just heard one of the most incredible stories of the most incredible person in the Texas Medical Center, and we are very grateful.